The snow came down hard on Ridgemont Hills that night, and the man standing before the black iron gate had nothing on his back but a coat worn through at the collar. He didn't knock. He simply stood there, looking up at the bars, like a man trying to recover something his own mind refused to hand back. The guard came out with his hands in his pockets and told him to move along. The old man didn't move. He asked one question, only one, in the dry voice of someone who hadn't had a warm drink in a long while. Who built this gate? The guard laughed. He didn't know. He'd only worked there 2 years. Then the black Bentley slid up to the curb. The door opened. A woman in fur stepped out holding a cup of coffee that was still steaming, and she looked at the old man for exactly 3 seconds, the way a person looks at a stain spreading across a good carpet. She didn't say sorry. She didn't say get out. She just tilted her hand. Hot coffee ran down into the snow, down over torn shoes, down onto the feet of the man who had poured every bucket of concrete that raised that gate with his own 2 hands, 40 years before. He didn't make a sound. And across the street, sitting in a car with the lights off, the young man he had raised as his youngest son, Spencer, pressed record not to save him, but to prove in a courtroom that the old man was no longer fit to run the empire. That was when they let the dog off the chain, 130 pounds of it, gray hide hanging loose, a growl like stones turning in a drainpipe. It came across the snow. The old man didn't run. He no longer remembered what running was for. Then somebody stepped into the space between them. A 26-year-old waitress, just off the night shift, with $9 in her pocket and a thin, adjustable silver chain bracelet she'd kept since before she could speak. She had no weapon. She had a metal serving tray and a voice too tired to be afraid. She saved him. She bandaged his arm. She fed him the bread she'd set aside for her own breakfast, the only meal she'd get that day. And the old man, his hands trembling from the thing that was quietly eating his memory, slipped a key into her coat pocket. She didn't know what it was. She didn't know the man she'd just saved owned half the harbor in that city. She didn't know he'd been walking Chicago for weeks in a torn coat, searching for a face he had never once seen. If this story reached something in you tonight, leave a like, share it with someone you think needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel because here, the gate always stays open. The back kitchen of the copper kettle was only as wide as a car, and at night, it was the warmest place in the entire neighborhood. Delaney pulled the plastic chair out from the corner, set it beside the sink, then gently guided the old man into it. He sat down like someone who had forgotten how much his own body weighed. His coat, worn thin around the collar, was soaked through, and when she took it off him, a patch of melting snow slid onto the tiled floor and gathered into a small gray puddle. She took the first aid kit down from the top of the refrigerator. It had been opened more times than she could count during the 4 years she'd worked there, mostly for herself, for grease burns, and the moments when a knife slipped at 3 o'clock in the morning after her body had stopped obeying her. She pushed up his sleeve. 3 parallel scratches ran along his forearm. They weren't deep, but they were bleeding slightly and caked with dirt. She washed them with warm water first. He didn't pull his arm away. He didn't wince. He only looked down at it as though it belonged to someone else. "This may sting a little," she said, applying antiseptic. He still didn't move. Delaney had met all kinds of people in that diner. Truck drivers who fell asleep over bowls of soup, people who had just lost their jobs and sat for 3 hours with a $2 cup of coffee, drunks, people who cried. She knew how to tell the difference between someone who was hurting and someone who was hiding. But this old man belonged to neither kind. He wasn't in pain. He simply wasn't there, like a house still filled with furniture after its owner had been gone for years. She wrapped the bandage around his arm, tore it with her teeth, and fastened it in place. "What's your name, sir?" He looked up. His pale gray eyes searched her face, and she saw the exact moment he tried. He truly tried. His entire face tightened like a man attempting to lift something far too heavy, and then it slipped from his hands, and he let it go. "I don't know," he said. She nodded without reacting. "Then where do you live?" "I don't know. Is there anyone I can call? Children? A wife?" He remained silent for so long that she thought he had fallen asleep with his eyes open. Then he spoke very slowly, one word at a time, like a man reading back something he'd written down so he wouldn't forget it. "I'm looking for someone. I have to find them before I forget that I'm looking." Delaney's hands went still. "Who are you looking for?" He opened his mouth. Then he closed it again. She waited. Outside, the wind drove snow against the kitchen window with a dry, scraping hiss. The electric clock on the wall ticked, The old man sat there with one hand still resting open on his lap, and he tried again. I'm looking for someone. I have to find them before I forget that I'm looking. The same sentence, the same rhythm, the same pause for breath. He wasn't repeating himself. It was simply all he had left, and he pulled it out like a man searching his pockets for the last scrap of paper he owned. She sat down on the flour bin across from him. All right, she said softly, then we'll find them. He looked at her, and then his face broke apart. It wasn't like any crying she had ever witnessed. There were no sobs, no moans. There was only water spilling from two gray eyes, running through the deep lines beside his mouth, while his shoulders shook in a clumsy, unnatural way, like a machine trying to perform a task it had never been built to do. This was the crying of a man who hadn't wept in 40 years, and his body no longer remembered how. Delaney didn't ask another question. She stood, turned on the stove, and ladled the last of the soup from the pot into a bowl. It was the final batch of the day, the one the owner told her to throw away, and the one she never did. She placed the bowl in front of him with a spoon and a paper napkin. Eat, she said. When you're finished, we'll figure out what comes next. He picked up the spoon. His hand trembled, and soup spilled over the rim of the bowl. She pretended not to notice. She turned away, opened the faucet, and washed the first aid kit, even though it didn't need washing, so he could eat without being watched. When she turned back, he had finished half the bowl. She reached across the table to take the empty dish beside him, and her sleeve slipped back from her wrist. The old man stopped. His spoon froze in midair, about a hand's length from his mouth, and remained there long enough for a drop of soup to fall back into the bowl. He didn't blink. He didn't breathe. He only stared. The man who had forgotten his own name, forgotten his home, and forgotten why he was sitting in a stranger's kitchen had found something on the wrist of the young woman who had just saved him, and in that exact moment, the world returned to him one small piece of what it had taken away 26 years before. About 15 miles to the south, inside an unnumbered warehouse at the edge of Halloran Harbor, no one was cooking soup for anyone. The warehouse was cold in the way only a building beside the water could be cold, the kind of cold that seeped upward from the concrete floor, passed through the soles of your shoes, and settled into your bones. A single lamp hanging from the ceiling cast a murky yellow circle onto the floor, and inside that circle stood a folding metal chair, and on that chair sat a man in a plaid shirt with both hands resting on his thighs. His name was Freddie Barlow. He had worked as an accountant for Halloran Group for 9 years, and 3 months earlier, he had begun selling shipping manifest data to a company in Milwaukee for $4,000 a month. No one had tied him up. No one had touched him. The warehouse door remained open. Snow continued to blow across the first meter of the floor, and Freddie Barlow remained seated, because there are rooms where an open door is more frightening than a locked one. Then August Halloran walked in, and the 2 men standing guard against the wall stepped back half a pace without even realizing they had moved. He was 34 years old, tall, with broad shoulders beneath an unbranded black wool coat, and he didn't look at Freddie even once. He pulled out a second chair, sat down across from him, placed a still warm paper takeout box on his lap, opened it, and began to eat. No one said a word. He finished everything. He truly finished it, one bite at a time, neither hurried nor slow, at exactly the pace of a man eating dinner in his own kitchen. Freddie Barlow watched him eat for 15 minutes that he would remember for the rest of his life. Then August folded the lid closed, set the box on the floor, pulled out a paper napkin, wiped each finger one by one, and finally looked up. "Your wife doesn't know," he said. His voice was ordinary, almost friendly, the voice of someone reminding a friend that rain was coming. "Your mother doesn't know. Your brother, the man who lent you $22,000 for the down payment on your house in Berwyn, the man you still haven't repaid a single dollar, doesn't know either. The woman from Human Resources who sometimes waits for you in the parking lot doesn't know. The priest at the church where you sit in the 4th pew every Sunday morning doesn't know." He paused. "I know." Freddie Barlow opened his mouth. August raised one finger, not as a threat, only to stop him, the way someone stops a plate from rolling off a table. "I haven't asked you a single question," he said. "I don't need an explanation. $4,000 a month is a very precise number. It tells me you aren't greedy. You're only afraid. Greedy men ask for more. Frightened men take just enough to let themselves sleep." He stood and brushed the crumbs from his trouser leg. "Tomorrow, you leave Illinois. You don't need to tell anyone why. Say you're changing jobs. Say you want to live closer to the ocean. Say whatever you like. And all those people will continue not knowing. That's what I'm giving you. Not money. I'm giving you the right to let them keep believing you're the man they've believed you were all these years. Freddie Barlow rose, his legs trembling so badly that he had to grip the back of the chair, and he walked toward the door without daring to look behind him. When the sound of his footsteps had disappeared into the snow, one of the two guards stepped forward. "Boss, do you want us to take care of him?" August picked up the paper food container from the floor, folded it neatly, and placed it inside his own coat pocket. "No," he said. "He isn't worth getting my hands dirty. I need him alive, far away, and quiet." Then the phone in his pocket vibrated. He looked at the screen. It was Hollis Price. He already knew what Hollis was going to say, because Hollis had said the exact same words every night for the past 13 days, and each night, those words had grown a little heavier. His adoptive father still hadn't come home. The second week began tonight. The following morning, on the 38th floor of the Halloran building on Wacker Drive, no one mentioned the snow. The conference room was warm, the carpet was thick, and 11 unopened bottles of mineral water stood on the table. Spencer Halloran stood at the head of the table in a navy blue suit, smiling the way he had practiced in front of a mirror since he was 16, the kind of smile that made people want to agree with him before he had finished speaking. In front of each person lay a thin gray file. His father's name was printed on the cover. Inside were diagnoses from 3 doctors and a petition for temporary guardianship. "The court will hold a hearing before the snow melts," Spencer said, in the voice of a man announcing an elevator maintenance schedule. No one in the room dared breathe too loudly. Marguerite Halloran sat to his right, her sunglasses still resting on the bridge of her nose, even though there wasn't a single ray of sunlight in the room, and she turned through the file with one finger, slowly, as though paging through an old newspaper. August wasn't seated. He stood at the far end of the room with his back against the glass wall, both hands in his coat pockets, and he had been standing there before the first person arrived. No one invited him to sit. No one dared. "We need one signature from every member of the family," Spencer said, and his eyes traveled to the end of the room. "August, you still haven't told me what you think." "I don't have an opinion," August said. "I have a question. What day did you file this petition?" Spencer hesitated for exactly 1 beat. "Last Tuesday. He disappeared on Monday," August said. "So you waited 1 day." The room fell silent. Someone lightly tapped a pen against the table, then stopped at once. Spencer placed both hands on the back of a chair, leaned forward, and lowered his voice until it sounded almost gentle, almost compassionate, and that was when he revealed more of himself than he had in everything else he'd said. "You go looking for him every night," he said. "I know. I've seen your car out on the streets, but you have to ask yourself something, August. Suppose you find him. Then what? Do you think he'll still recognize you?" August looked at him. He didn't change his posture, didn't take his hands from his pockets, didn't raise so much as an eyebrow. He simply looked at Spencer long enough for everyone in the room to understand that what was happening wasn't an argument. "I don't need him to recognize me," he said. "I need him to still be breathing." Then he pushed away from the glass wall and walked toward the door. He didn't slam it. He didn't say another word. He didn't look at anyone. He left before the vote. And by doing so, he turned that vote into the most meaningless thing that had ever taken place in that room. The door closed behind him. No one picked up a pen. Spencer straightened, adjusted his cuff, and tried to smile again. But this time, the smile wouldn't stay on his face. Marguerite continued staring at the door that had just closed. She didn't remove her sunglasses. She spoke very softly, too softly for anyone but her younger brother to hear. "He'll find him before we do. He always does." 38 floors below them, snow continued falling over the city, and in a small kitchen a few miles away, an old man was asleep in a plastic chair with his white bandaged arm resting neatly across his lap. Delaney took him home before dawn had begun to break, walking 3 blocks through the snow with one arm braced beneath his shoulder and the other hand clutching the collar of her coat closed. The place where she lived was on the 2nd floor above a laundromat that had been closed for 4 years, its sign still hanging over the street with half the letters in Kessler peeled away, and the staircase leading up was so narrow that 2 people had to climb it single file. The apartment had 1 room, a kitchen 3 steps wide, 1 window facing the brick wall of the building next door, and the smell of steam and soap had soaked so deeply into the walls that it would never entirely disappear. Ruth Kessler was sitting at the kitchen table, as she did every morning, both hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone cold long ago. She was 71 years old, so small that her cardigan always looked as though she had borrowed it from someone else, and her hands were covered with smooth, shining patches left behind by 30 years of steam. She looked up when the door opened, and she stared. Delaney had lived with her for years. She had watched Ruth face creditors, doctors, and the news that her kidneys were no longer working, and she had never seen her look at anyone that way. She didn't look at the torn coat. She didn't look at the arm wrapped in white bandages. She looked directly into the old man's face, and she held his gaze longer than politeness allowed, longer than curiosity required, long enough for Delaney to begin feeling something tighten inside her chest. The cup of tea in Ruth's hands didn't move a single millimeter. "I know I shouldn't have," Delaney said quickly, her voice already prepared for an argument. "But he has nowhere to go, Mom. He can't even remember his own name. I couldn't leave him out there. Just a few nights, I promise. I'll find somewhere for him. I'll call the city. Ruth raised one hand. She lifted it only a few inches from the cup. Delaney fell silent. The old woman set the cup down very gently, without making a sound, then spoke, and her voice was so ordinary that the ordinary sound of it was what felt wrong. "Give him the thick blanket." Delaney blinked. "Which one?" "The one in the closet. The brown one." Ruth still hadn't taken her eyes off the old man. "He's been cold for a long time." Then she stood, carried the cold tea to the sink, poured it away, and didn't say another word for the rest of the morning. Delaney spread the blanket over the couch in the living room, helped the old man sit down, and he obeyed like a child in a stranger's home. She was so exhausted that the moment her head touched the pillow, the entire world went dark, so she heard nothing. She didn't hear Ruth's bare feet crossing the wooden floor at midnight. She didn't see the old woman pull out the chair on the other side of the table and sit down in the darkness, exactly one tabletop away from the old man, without turning on a light. The only illumination in the kitchen came from the tavern sign across the street, faint, red, and flickering. The old man was awake. He was staring at his hands. "You don't remember me," Ruth said. He looked up. He studied her for a long time, trying in the same way he had tried with Delaney in the diner kitchen, and then it slipped away from him again. "I don't even remember myself," he said. Ruth nodded slowly. She didn't sigh with relief. She didn't smile. Something passed across her face that Delaney would have remembered for the rest of her life if she had seen it, but Delaney was asleep, and no one saw. "Good," the old woman said. "Then keep it that way. Don't remember." He didn't ask what she meant. He no longer remembered how to ask. And the woman who had lifted that baby from the church steps 26 years earlier sat in the darkness, exactly one tabletop away from the child's father, and begged heaven and earth to let him go on forgetting. The coat stank. Not of a person, but of weeks spent outdoors, of filthy snow and exhaust fumes and something faintly sour that had seeped deep into the lining. Delaney lifted it from the back of the chair late that afternoon, while the old man was sleeping, and carried it downstairs, where 2 old industrial washing machines could still be made to run even though the laundromat itself had been dead for years. She turned out the pockets by habit, the habit of someone who had once washed other people's clothes for money and had seen every kind of thing a person could leave behind. The right pocket was empty. The left held a notebook. It was small enough to fit in her palm, with a brown leather cover worn smooth at all 4 corners in the way only years spent inside a coat pocket could accomplish. The elastic band wrapped around it had gone slack. She stood there between the 2 silent washing machines, knowing she shouldn't open it. She opened it. The first page contained only 4 lines, written in ballpoint pen. The handwriting slanted and trembling. The hand of someone who had once written with absolute steadiness and no longer could. "You don't remember your name. That's all right. You remember why you left. Don't trust anyone wearing a suit." Delaney read those 4 lines 3 times. Then she turned the page. The next page held 4 lines as well. So did the page after that. The entire notebook, from beginning to end, was one man writing letters to the person he would become tomorrow. Some pages only reminded him how to tie his shoes. One page contained nothing but a warning that the day was cold and he shouldn't sleep outside the train station. On another, the same sentence had been written over and over perhaps a dozen times, each version leaning farther than the one before it, as though he feared that if he wrote it fewer times, it might escape. There was no name, no address, not a single surname, telephone number, or trail she could follow. Delaney began turning the pages faster, searching, and the more she searched, the more the cold inside her chest began to rise. Because a man who forgot everything yet remained careful enough never to write down his own name wasn't merely a man who had forgotten, he was a man in hiding. She reached the final page that contained writing. The ink there was still fresh, still pressed into the paper, written not long ago. Find the diner that still has its lights on after the entire city has gone dark. The girl will be there. Delaney stood motionless for a long time. The washing machine beside her made a single clicking sound as its drum cooled. She read the words again, then read them once more, and each time she did, her reason pushed them a little farther away, because that was the only thing it could do. He was ill. Any doctor would tell her that people at this stage invented stories, that people at this stage believed in things that had never happened, that people at this stage went searching for those they had lost 30 years earlier, and remained certain they were waiting around the next corner. Chicago had hundreds of diners that kept their lights on all night. Chicago had thousands of young women working night shifts inside them. She was one of those women, and that was all. She closed the notebook, wound the elastic band around it, and slipped it back into the left pocket. Then she hung the coat on a hook and decided she wouldn't wash it, because the water might bleed the ink away. And even though she didn't believe a single word written inside, that notebook was still everything the man had managed to keep of himself. She stepped back. Something fell from the pocket of her own coat, the one she was wearing, and struck the concrete floor with a small, sharp metallic clink that rang with startling clarity through the empty laundromat. Delaney looked down. It was a key. It was heavier than a house key. It didn't belong to her, and she had no idea when it had found its way into her pocket. The key haunted her for 2 days. It lay in the drawer beside her bed, and every time she passed it, she thought about it, and the thought kept growing into something that refused to leave her alone, because there was a simple logic she couldn't argue with. The old man had stood in front of that gate. He had asked who built it. They had driven him away like a stray animal, but people didn't drive strangers away that way. They drove strangers away by calling the police. People only threw coffee at someone they found troublesome, and they only found trouble in those who had once belonged there. She thought he must have worked there. As a gardener, perhaps. A guard, a plumber, an old man who had spent his entire life working for wealthy people, then grown ill and been forgotten, while the key to the last place where he had ever been useful remained in his pocket. Somewhere inside that enormous house, there had to be someone who knew his name. There had to be someone waiting for him. On Saturday morning, she woke earlier than she did even for a night shift. She put on the nicest clothes she owned, a blue sweater and black pants she had worn only twice in 4 years. Once when she went to the hospital with Ruth, and once when she interviewed for the job she didn't get. She brushed her hair back. She wiped her shoes with a damp paper towel. She studied her reflection in the dark glass door of the laundromat downstairs, and for half a second, she looked like someone who had the right to knock on another person's door. She took 2 buses. The first ride lasted 40 minutes. The second bus traveled along a road bordered only by stone walls and rows of trees, and each time it stopped, fewer people remained, until she was the last passenger aboard. She walked the final stretch through the snow. The gate looked different in daylight. It wasn't taller, but it was cleaner, and that cleanliness was what made a person feel dirty. Delaney pressed the bell. She had practiced her words throughout the entire bus ride. I found an old man. He has a key to this house. Is anyone here missing a family member? She wasn't there to ask for anything. She wanted to make that clear in the very first sentence. The guard came out first, looked at her through the iron bars, and she said the words she had rehearsed, and he told her to wait. Then the woman appeared. A fur coat, sunglasses in the middle of a sunless morning, walking across the snow in shoes that never slipped. She didn't open the gate. She stood inside, and Delaney stood outside, with black painted iron bars between them. Delaney repeated herself a second time, more slowly, and held up the key so the woman could see it. Marguerite Halloran looked, and there was one brief moment, so brief that it would take Delaney months to understand she had witnessed it, when the woman's entire body went still, because Marguerite knew what the keys to this house looked like. She knew the gardener's key, the pool cleaner's key, the side door key, and the storage room key, and the one in the girl's hand wasn't any of them. She removed her sunglasses. What's your name? Delaney Woods, ma'am. Where do you work? At a diner, on Lakewood Street. Marguerite nodded slowly, and then she smiled, and that smile was worse than no smile at all. Do you know how many girls stand exactly where you're standing every month? She asked. 4. 4 on average. Some bring photographs, some bring hospital papers, some bring an elderly woman and claim she's a real aunt. Last month, one brought a ring. Do you know why? Delaney didn't answer. Because my father lost something, Marguerite said, and this entire city caught the scent of money. I'm not here for money. They all say that. She put her sunglasses back on. Drop the key and get out of here. Delaney remained there for 3 more seconds. Those 3 seconds would return to find her in the late hours of the night for years to come. Then she turned away. She didn't throw down the key. She held it in her fist through both bus rides home, squeezing so tightly that when she stepped off the bus, the jagged outline of its teeth had been pressed into her palm. That night, she went to work. The diner was quiet. An old man in a suit sat at the counter, his hair silver, a leather briefcase resting on the stool beside him. He ordered a cup of black coffee, and while Delaney was busy in the back kitchen, he quietly slipped the water glass she had just been drinking from into his briefcase, left money beneath the saucer, and walked out the door. Delaney watched him leave and thought that every year, this city filled with a few more madmen. Meanwhile, in Ridgemont Hills, the moment the girl's figure disappeared beyond the bend in the road, Marguerite Halloran stepped away from the window and pulled a phone from the pocket of her fur coat. "Spencer," she said, "I know where he is." 3 nights later, the copper kettle was so empty that Delaney could hear the refrigerator breathing. Outside, the snow had stopped, but the wind hadn't, and the neon sign beyond the window kept flashing out of rhythm. Red, dark, red. She was wiping down the counter when the door opened. The man who entered didn't stamp his feet, shake off the snow, or make any of the ordinary movements people made when they stepped out of the cold and into warmth. He simply walked straight to the counter and sat on the second stool, and in that moment, Delaney knew exactly what kind of man she was looking at. She had known men like him all her life. A tailored black coat with no label and not a single crease. A watch with a plain face and no visible brand. Expensive enough that it didn't need to tell anyone what it cost. No gloves, even though it was 10 degrees below zero outside. People only went without gloves when they wanted their hands ready at all times. Ruth owed $22,000 for medicine and dialysis. 3 men had come asking for payment over the past 4 months. None of them had looked like this, and that was precisely why she was afraid. Her hand slid beneath the counter on its own, toward the bread knife the owner had kept there for longer than anyone could remember, and she pulled it out and pointed it at the man's chest before she had time to decide whether she was really going to do it. The man didn't step back. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't blink. He looked down at the blade hovering about a hand's breadth from his coat, then lifted his eyes to hers, and his voice was so calm that it chilled her more deeply than the wind beyond the door. "You're holding it with the wrong hand," he said. Delaney didn't move. "If I pull your wrist toward me," he said, "the blade will turn back and cut into your wrist before it ever reaches me. You're holding it like a pen. Didn't anyone teach you?" He raised one hand. Slowly, very slowly, and he didn't push the knife away. He touched her fingers, turned her wrist by a slight angle, drew her thumb down along the spine of the blade, and gently pressed her elbow against her ribs. "Hold it like this," he said. "Don't reach out. Keep it close to your body. And next time, don't hesitate." You hesitated for 4 seconds. 4 seconds is a long time. Then he released her hand and settled back into his former position, as though he had merely shown her how to fold a napkin. Delaney was still holding the knife. She didn't lower it. Her heartbeat thundered inside her ears. "What do you want?" "Coffee?" he said. "And I'm looking for an old man." Her stomach dropped straight through the floor. She kept her face perfectly still. She had learned how to do that when she was 15. Learned that her face was the one thing no one could take from her as long as she knew how to lock it shut. What old man? About 68 years old. Tall, short silver hair. He may not remember his own name. He may ask something very strange, then stand there without saying another word. "This place is full of men like that at night," Delaney said. "You'll have to be more specific." The man looked at her. He looked for a long time, and in the flickering red neon light, she could see that he didn't believe a single word she had said. She saw something else, too. Something she couldn't understand. He wasn't angry. "You're a terrible liar," he said, almost gently. "But you're lying for someone else, not for yourself. That's rare." She didn't answer. He stood. From the inside pocket of his coat, he took out a folded stack of bills held together with a steel paper clip, not a wallet, and placed it neatly beneath the saucer, like a man paying for a meal he hadn't eaten. "If that old man comes by," he said, "don't call anyone. Just let him sit somewhere warm. "This is the warmest place I've found in 6 blocks." Then he walked toward the door. Delaney stared at the money. She didn't count it. She didn't need to. One glance told her it was more than 3 months of her wages. She thought about the dialysis bill, on top of the refrigerator. She thought about Ruth. Then she came around the counter, snatched up the money, shoved open the door, and threw it into the street. It landed in the snow in front of his shoes, and the steel clip sprang loose, sending the bills fanning out across the white ground. "We don't sell people here," she said. The man bent down. He picked up each bill one at a time, without hurry, brushed away the snow, and clipped the stack together again. Then he straightened and looked at her. He stood there longer than necessary. He studied her face beneath the red neon glow, and something shifted inside his eyes, slowly and deeply. Like a heavy thing turning over at the bottom of dark water, something distant and ancient struggling to rise but unable to reach the surface. He opened his mouth. He said nothing. Then he turned and disappeared into the wind. He hadn't yet had time to do anything with what he'd found beneath her fierce exterior when his phone rang, and the person on the other end said only one sentence. Someone had just opened one of his containers in the south yard. August drove there in 30 minutes, and he went alone, bringing no one with him, because bringing men would mean admitting that something there was important enough to require them. His car stopped about 20 meters from the yard gate. He stepped out, closed the door, and began walking. There were 12 men in the yard. He counted them the instant his feet touched the ground, and the number didn't make him stop. They stood scattered among steel containers stacked as high as 3-story buildings, watching him enter, and not one of them moved. A man holding an iron bar stood near the wide-open container door, and as August passed him, the man lowered the bar naturally, as though his arm had grown tired. 2 men stood in his path, and they moved apart before he came close enough to ask them. No one spoke. No one cursed. No one reached inside his coat. There was only the sound of one man's shoes crossing wet concrete, and that was the only sound in a yard as large as 3 football fields, steady and unbroken until he stopped in front of Callahan Driscoll. Cal sat on the step of a truck with both hands tucked into the pockets of his leather jacket, and beside his feet lay a length of chain. The mastiff was curled on the ground and didn't lift its head. Cal smiled. He smiled because he had to, because he had 12 men, and the other man had none, and because if he didn't smile, those 12 men would see his hands. "Halloran," he said, looking handsome. "Come alone?" "You opened my container," August said. "I opened your brother's container," Cal said. "He owes me $4,200,000. He told me to wait. I've waited 3 months. I only took enough merchandise to cover part of it. Call it interest. You can count it again if you like." August looked at the open container. Then he looked at Cal. "You took my merchandise," he said. "I don't care. Merchandise can be replaced. Touch the old man, and I'll care." And there was a moment. A very brief one. Briefer even than the moment Marguerite Halloran had gone, still at the gate when she saw the key. Cal Driscoll tilted his head to one side. His smile didn't disappear. It merely stopped, hanging on his face like something someone had forgotten to remove. Then he asked, and he asked sincerely, completely sincerely, in the voice of a man who had just heard a name he'd never heard before. "What old man?" The yard went silent. Wind slipped through the gap between 2 rows of containers with a long, thin whistle. August Halloran stood there, and inside his mind, everything locked into place at once, fast and cold and impossible to take apart again. Cal didn't know. Cal had never known. The entire city believed Conrad Halloran had been lying somewhere beneath the snow for the past 2 weeks, and that belief was the only thing keeping the old man safe, because no one hunted a man who was already dead. No one in that yard had any reason to search for him. Not until 3 seconds ago. Not until August himself, the man who hadn't wasted a single word in 10 years, had stood among 12 men belonging to a loan shark and revealed that there was an old man still alive whom he was willing to burn the entire harbor to protect. He had just given Cal Driscoll the most valuable thing a man like Cal could ever hold in his hands. He had given him leverage. August's face didn't change. It was the only thing he could still control. He looked at Cal for 2 more seconds, then turned and walked away at exactly the same pace he'd entered, and the 12 men parted once again to let him pass. Behind him, Cal Driscoll remained seated on the truck step, and the smile on his face slowly changed into something entirely different. The man who hadn't made a single mistake in 10 years had just made one, and he would pay for it with someone else's blood. He didn't go home that night. He sat in his car at the end of Lakewood Street until dawn, and by the time the sun rose, He had made one decision. The old man couldn't remain there for another night. Cal Driscoll already had the leverage in his hands. It was only a matter of time before he came looking for it. August pushed open the diner door in the middle of the morning, and the girl behind the counter recognized him at once, and her hand slid beneath the counter again. "You won't need that," he said. "I've come to take my father home." Delaney stood still. She looked at him and thought of the leather-bound notebook, thought of the 4 words, "Don't trust anyone wearing a suit," and the man standing before her wore a coat worth more than an entire year of her rent. "Your father," she said. "Conrad Halloran." She didn't know that name. She had never read the financial pages, but she knew the name Halloran because she had stood outside an iron gate while a woman in a fur coat told her to get out, and during those 3 seconds, she had read the name engraved on the brass plaque beside the gatepost. She stepped back half a pace. "You work for her," she said. "The woman at that house." "She's my sister," August said. "And no, I don't work for her. You can stand there if you want, but he's in danger, and I need to take him away today." Delaney studied him for a long time. Then she turned, walked through the back kitchen door, and brought the old man out. He sat in the chair beside the window, his white bandaged hand still resting neatly on his lap, and he looked up. He looked directly into the face of the man standing in the middle of the diner. Daylight fell across both of them, and then he asked, "Who are you?" August didn't move. "Are you here to collect a debt?" The old man said. "I don't have any money. I don't remember who I owe. But don't bother this girl. She has nothing to do with it." Delaney stepped forward. She placed one hand gently on his shoulder and spoke in the voice she had used with him throughout the past 2 weeks, the voice people used when guiding someone through a dark place. "Sir, this is your son. He's been searching for you for a very long time." Conrad Halloran shook his head. He did it slowly and patiently, without the slight irritation, like a man correcting a small mistake for a child. "No," he said. "I don't have a son." The entire diner went silent. "I have a daughter," he said, "but they told me she died." August Halloran stood there for exactly 4 more seconds. Then he turned and walked toward the door. He didn't slam it. He went out to the black car parked at the curb and stopped beside it, and for one moment, he still looked completely normal. Then his fist came down. It wasn't like a punch in a movie. It was ugly, untrained, and repeated again and again. Once, twice, 5 times, 10 times, the steel denting beneath his knuckles, and he didn't make a sound. The man whose presence made an entire harbor hold its breath was standing outside a diner on Lakewood Street, striking his own car until he could no longer feel his hand. The diner door opened. Delaney stepped outside without a coat, both arms wrapped around her shoulders against the cold. She didn't run toward him. She didn't tell him to stop. She stood 3 steps away in the snow and waited until his fist stopped on its own. "He hasn't forgotten you," she said. August didn't turn around. "You don't know anything. I know one thing," she said. "I've kept his notebook for 2 weeks. I've watched him write to himself every day so he won't lose who he is. A man like that doesn't forget anyone. He only set you down for a little while, the way people put a bag on the ground when their arms become too tired to carry it." She stepped 1 pace closer. "Just stay there," she said. "Stay exactly where he set you down. He'll pick you up again." August Halloran turned his head and looked at her. He said nothing. He only nodded once, very slightly. And the waitress, with $9 in her pocket, stood there in the snow until he climbed into his car, because she understood something he didn't yet know, that no one should be left alone in the moment they have just broken. But getting the old man to leave was another matter. Shaking his head inside the diner, Conrad stubbornly refused to step foot outside, no matter how much Delaney tried to coax him. He offered no explanation. He only said no, then turned toward the window. And the clarity he had possessed that morning went dark like a lamp whose plug had been pulled. So they compromised. August stationed 2 of his men in a car at the end of the street 24 hours a day, and Delaney agreed to take the old man for an examination at Mercy. And on Thursday morning, all 3 of them were there. A waitress, an old man, and a man in a black coat sitting in the hallway and watching the clock. By the time the examination was finished, it was nearly noon. On their way out, they passed the neonatal ward. Delaney stopped. She hadn't intended to stop. Her feet stopped before she could tell them not to. Beyond the glass was a warm room washed in pale yellow light, and inside it stood 6 transparent bassinets arranged in 2 rows, each holding a sleeping baby wrapped tightly in a white blanket like a small gift. A nurse moved between the rows, adjusted the corner of one blanket, then continued on. No sound escaped through the glass. Delaney stood there. She raised one hand and placed her palm against the window, and she left it there without saying a word. She stood longer than an ordinary person would have stood, much longer. The golden light from inside the room fell across her face, and no one in that hallway knew which bassinet she was looking at. August saw her. He stood about 5 meters away, and he saw everything, and he didn't ask a single question. There are things that, once asked about, take away the last thing another person still possesses, and he understood that better than anyone else in that building. Then Conrad, seated in a plastic chair in the hallway, looked up. He didn't remember what examination he had just undergone. He didn't remember her name, but some fragment inside him remained sharp, and it looked at her only once. "You lost someone once," he said. Delaney didn't turn around. She didn't answer. She simply lifted her hand from the glass, leaving behind a faint mark in the shape of 5 fingers, and continued walking. At the cashier's desk on the first floor, she stood in line to ask about Ruth's next dialysis treatment, and she had already prepared the words she would use to beg for more time. She had rehearsed them 3 times in her head. "Please give me 2 more weeks. I'll take more shifts." The nurse typed something into the computer, then looked up and told her it wasn't necessary. "What isn't necessary?" "Everything has already been paid," the nurse said. "The entire course of treatment. Even the unpaid sessions dating back to September. Someone paid all of it this morning." Delaney stood perfectly still. "Who?" "They didn't leave a name. They paid in cash." And Delaney Woods, who hadn't cried when she was driven away from the gate in Ridgemont Hills, who hadn't cried during 4 years of working the night shift, began to weep in the middle of Mercy's hospital lobby in front of more than a dozen strangers. She had to hold on to the edge of the counter. She cried like someone who had just had a boulder lifted from her chest, and she apologized to the nurse 3 times while she was crying. She ran home. She climbed the stairs 2 steps at a time, pushed open the door, and told Ruth everything, speaking so quickly that the words stumbled over one another. "Mom, it's gone. Someone paid all of it, even September. You don't have to worry anymore." Ruth Kessler was sitting at the kitchen table. She listened to every word. She didn't smile. She set down her cup of tea and spoke with perfect calm. "Call them. Tell them to take it back." Delaney froze in the middle of the room. "What did you say?" "Give it back," Ruth said. "I won't take that man's money." "Mom." Delaney heard her own voice break. "That money is saving your life. Do you understand? Without it, your dialysis stops next month. You know what stopping dialysis means." "I know." "Then why?" Ruth looked at her daughter for a very long time, and the words she finally spoke answered nothing at all. "There are debts that become an insult when they're paid with money," she said. Then she stood, quietly emptying her cold cup into the sink, a silent gesture that spoke of a lifetime of carrying her own heavy burdens without ever complaining. Delaney stood there without understanding a single word. That night, she lay in bed and heard water running in the bathroom. It ran for a long time, far longer than necessary, and beneath the sound of the water was something else. Delaney lay still in the darkness and listened to her adoptive mother crying behind the thin wooden door. The old woman hadn't cried when her husband died. She hadn't cried when the laundromat closed. She hadn't cried on the day the doctor sat down across from her, folded both hands together, and told her how much longer her kidneys would continue working. August's 2 men were sitting in the car parked at the end of the street, and they were good at what they did. They had been doing this for 10 years, but they were watching the front entrance. No one thought about the alley behind the laundromat, because the alley was a dead end, because it led only to a rusted iron door that the landlord had welded shut years ago. Cal Driscoll didn't go through that door. He went through the abandoned laundromat on the first floor, and he entered in the simplest way imaginable. He smashed the small pane of glass in the side door, reached inside, and lifted the latch. Delaney heard the glass break at nearly 1 o'clock in the morning. She was sitting at the kitchen table with bills spread out in front of her, and she sprang to her feet and looked at Ruth, and neither of them said a word because they both already knew. There are sounds that poor people learn to recognize very early in life. "Take him and go," Ruth said. "You're coming with me. Take him and go, Delaney." The old woman had risen from her chair. She stood there in her oversized sweater, barefoot on the cold wooden floor, not even as tall as her daughter's shoulder. "The bedroom window opens onto the fire escape. Go up to the roof, cross over to number 41, and use their stairs to get down. Go, right now." Delaney had already pulled the old man to his feet. He didn't ask any questions. He let her pull him. Below them, the footsteps had reached the 5th stair, and there came the sound of claws scraping against wood, a dense, heavy sound that couldn't be mistaken for anything else. Delaney pushed the old man through the window, and before climbing out after him, she turned her head once. Ruth Kessler was walking toward the top of the staircase. The old woman stood on the highest step. That staircase was so narrow that two people had to climb it single file, and she knew it. She had gone up and down those stairs for 30 years, carrying baskets twice her own weight, and now she stood directly in the middle of it with both hands, marked by years of steam burns, hanging at her sides. Cal Driscoll reached the 10th step and stopped. 3 men stood behind him. A chain hung from his hand. "Move, old woman. This is my home," Ruth said. "I'm not looking for you. I'm looking for the old man." "There isn't any old man here," Cal laughed. He looked at the 71-year-old body blocking the staircase, a body he could have lifted with one hand, and he found it amusing. He loosened the chain from around his wrist and let part of it slip downward. "Let it smell," he told the man behind him. "It finds everything. It even found the coat." The mastiff stepped forward, 130 pounds, gray wrinkled skin, head lowered, and it sniffed. It sniffed the steps. It sniffed along the doorframe. Then it stopped. It raised its head. It stood in the middle of the staircase and looked toward the open bedroom door, where there was a scent it knew. It had known that scent since a snowy night nearly 2 weeks earlier, the night an old man had stood beneath a street lamp with his forearm still bleeding, tossed it a piece of bread, then sat on the curb and watched it eat. No one in that dog's life had ever given it anything without demanding something in return. The mastiff stood still. It didn't growl. It didn't bare its teeth. It simply stood there in the middle of the staircase and refused to take another step. "Go," Cal said. The dog didn't move. Cal jerked hard on the chain. He threw his entire body into the pull, and the chain snapped taut with a dry metallic crack, but the 130-pound animal remained fixed in place like a stone driven into the wooden step. It didn't make a sound. It only planted all 4 paws, flattened its ears, and refused to move. Cal pulled a second time. Nothing. His face changed color. There were 4 men on that staircase, and every one of them was watching his dog refuse him. He threw the chain onto the floor. "Leave it there," he said, and he stepped past the animal and walked directly toward the old woman. What happened next was very brief. Ruth Kessler didn't move aside. She stretched out both arms to block the doorway, and Cal swept her away as someone might brush aside a branch obstructing the path, and the staircase was narrow and steep, and the wood had been worn smooth by 30 years of footsteps. There was a sound, only one. It wasn't loud. Then silence. 4 men stood frozen on the dark staircase, and in the middle of that silence, the only creature in this entire story that no one had ever taught about gratitude was the only one who still remembered who had fed it. They placed her on the 4th floor of Mercy Hospital, in a room with a window overlooking the parking lot, and the doctor on duty that night was a young man who spoke very softly. He asked Delaney to step into the hallway. He spoke about Ruth's kidneys, about her heart, about how the body of a 71-year-old woman who was already weak had no room left to endure anything more. He explained all of it with great kindness and perfect clarity, and then he handed her a sheet of paper and a pen, and he told her that if Ruth's heart stopped, they could compress her chest. They could do those things. But at her age, and in her condition, those measures would only prolong something without saving anything, and the family had the right to choose to let her go peacefully. Then he pointed to an empty box at the bottom of the page. Delaney took the pen. Her hand couldn't write. She stared at it as though it belonged to someone else, and her fingers trembled so badly that the tip of the pen tapped against the paper 3 separate times. Tap, tap, tap. And she had to grip her right wrist with her left hand and force it down. The doctor waited. He had handed this form to hundreds of people, and he had never seen anyone tremble like that. "Take all the time you need," he said. She signed. The handwriting didn't look like her signature. Then she handed the paper back, went into the room, pulled a chair beside the bed, and took the steam-scarred hand of her adoptive mother into her own. Ruth woke once. Only once. Near dawn. When the parking lot beyond the window had begun to turn from black to gray, her eyes opened, and she found Delaney immediately, without losing even a second. "Mom." Ruth squeezed her hand. Weakly, but she squeezed. "I didn't save you," she said. Her voice was so faint that Delaney had to lean closer. "What did you say?" "I didn't save you, Delaney. I only picked you up. Anyone can pick up a child," she breathed. Every breath cost her something. "The person who saved you was you." Every day, you remained kind in a world that was never kind to you for even one day. You did that for 26 years. I only stood and watched. Mom, don't talk anymore. Save your strength. There isn't any strength left to save. Ruth turned her head on the pillow. Her eyes traveled once across the ceiling, then came back to find Delaney's face, and there was something in them Delaney had never seen in 10 years, something both fierce and urgent, something belonging to a person who knew she had exactly one chance left. Listen to me. At home, the cabinet in my room, the bottom drawer, beneath the towels. The bottom drawer, Delaney repeated. There's a tin box. Her hand tightened, far more strongly than anything remaining in her body should have allowed. Open it, and you'll understand. Understand what, Mom? Ruth Kessler looked at her daughter, and she spoke the final 3 sentences of her life, each one shorter than the last. I'm sorry. I was afraid. I was afraid for 26 years. Then her eyes closed. The machine beside her didn't scream. No one came running into the room. Nothing happened at all, because there was a sheet of paper bearing a trembling signature inside the file outside, and that paper said this woman was allowed to leave in peace. The green line on the monitor slowed, then slowed again, and finally stretched straight. Delaney Woods didn't cry. She sat perfectly upright in the plastic chair. She continued holding that hand inside her own, and she held it that way, neither tightening her grip nor letting go. She didn't collapse across the bed. She didn't make a sound. She didn't call anyone. A nurse passed the doorway, glanced inside, and saw a young woman sitting straight-backed beside an old woman's bed, silent, orderly, disturbing no one, and the nurse continued walking because it didn't look as though anything was happening inside that room. It was the kind of pain carried by someone who had learned at 15 that if she made too much noise, people would move her somewhere else. Morning slowly brightened beyond the window. Then footsteps sounded in the hallway, and the door opened, and August Halloran stood there. He looked at the bed. He looked at her. He didn't say a single word. He didn't ask what time Ruth had gone. He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't ask whether she needed anything. He didn't say any of the things people usually said at the doors of rooms like this one. He simply walked inside, pulled the second plastic chair out from the corner, placed it beside hers, and sat down. And he remained there until morning. Delaney returned home late that afternoon, went straight into Ruth's room, and pulled open the bottom drawer. Beneath a stack of towels folded into neat squares was a rectangular tin box, the kind people gave one another at the holidays with cookies inside, its lid chipped and peeling. It was heavier than she expected. She sat down on the floor and opened it, and inside there were only 2 things, a yellowed newspaper clipping and a letter folded into quarters. She opened the clipping first, and in the last light of day, filtering through the window that faced the brick wall, 26 years unfolded before her. There had been a blizzard in Chicago that night. Mercy Hospital was overcrowded and understaffed, and on the 3rd floor, a woman had just died from hemorrhaging after childbirth, while her husband sat collapsed in the hallway outside, with his calloused hands covering his face. The family's housekeeper was a woman named Vera. She had worked for them for 11 years, and she had 2 children of her own, a son and a daughter, both of them growing up in the servants' room behind the kitchen. Vera entered the nursery. She lifted the baby from its bassinet. No one stopped her, because she belonged to the family, because everyone was running that night, because in a hospital already breaking apart, no one could keep count of the cradles. She walked into the hallway. At the far end sat a 10-year-old girl waiting for her mother, her feet swinging above the floor, and she looked up as her mother passed with a white bundle in her arms. She didn't understand anything. She only watched. Then she lowered her eyes to her own hands, because that was what a 10-year-old child did when an adult walked past without saying a word. Vera stopped at the nurse's station. She signed a name inside an empty box, 4 letters, written in careful, rounded strokes. Then she went outside and disappeared into the storm. St. Bridget Church was 3 blocks away. She placed the white bundle on the steps beneath the archway, where it was sheltered from the wind, and wrapped another blanket around it. And before she left, she did something no one could understand. She left the thin silver bracelet around the baby's wrist, instead of removing it. Then she walked away. She had gone perhaps 20 steps when a figure separated itself from the lamppost across the street, a nurse from the night shift. She had followed Vera all the way from the hospital entrance through the storm, wearing no snow boots, only a pair of thin canvas shoes. She ran to the church steps and lifted the baby before even 10 minutes had passed. And Vera came back. The two women stood facing one another in the snow before the locked doors of the church. Vera didn't beg. Vera didn't cry. She spoke only one sentence, and that sentence was enough to destroy an entire life. Tell anyone, and I'll say you kidnapped her. Who do you think they'll believe? A night shift nurse, or Conrad Halloran's housekeeper? The letter inside the tin box was written in the slanting, trembling hand of an old woman. I was the one who picked you up. I knew who you were from the first day. I kept you because I was a coward. Forgive me, if you still have any room left for forgiveness. That woman had loved and protected the baby she rescued from the very beginning, living in fear that she herself was the one who had stolen her. Even when the state temporarily placed Delaney into foster care during a period of Ruth's severe illness, Delaney had run away at 15 for one sole purpose: to find her way back to the only mother she had ever known. That same afternoon, on the 38th floor of the building on Wacker Drive, August Halloran pushed open the door to his younger brother's office and threw a photocopied file onto the desk. Read page 4, he said. Spencer smiled first, out of habit. Have you ever heard of knocking? Page 4. He opened the file. He glanced down, and it was the glance of a man already searching for a place to argue. Then he stopped. August studied his younger brother's face very carefully for the next 30 seconds, because he had come there to do one thing: to look at that face and know. He had been certain Spencer knew. He had believed throughout the entire drive that his adoptive younger brother had been sitting on this secret for 26 years. But the blood drained from Spencer Halloran's face, beginning at his forehead and moving downward, and no one could imitate that. He read it again. He read it a third time, his finger moving across the 2 case numbers, then stopping at the signature in the lower corner, the careful rounded handwriting he had seen on hundreds of notes taped to the refrigerator throughout his childhood. Then he lurched to his feet, rushed out of the office, and August heard him vomiting in the restroom across the hall. When he returned, his tie was gone and his face was wet. He stood in the doorway and didn't dare enter his own office. 26 years, he said. His voice no longer held any trace of the one he had practiced in front of a mirror. I knew I was adopted, August. I thought we were just lucky orphans he took in after his daughter died. I never knew Vera was my real mother. I never knew she stole his real baby just to put me in that yellow room. I always thought he painted it for me. He looked down at his hands. I took her place at the dinner table, living a life built on a lie. And I swear to you, I didn't know. That night, August's phone vibrated. It was Spencer. Tomorrow, he said. You take that to court. And there wasn't a single grain of remorse in his voice. There was only the pure horror of a man who had just discovered that his entire life had been built upon the bones of a child. Delaney asked him that question in the funeral home parking lot, after everyone else had gone, and only the snow remained, falling around the two of them. What are you going to do to him? August held his car keys in one hand. He didn't look at her. I'm already doing it, he said. Nothing exploded. No one knocked on Cal Driscoll's door at midnight. What happened to him over the next 3 days was so quiet that it took him a day and a half to understand that it was happening at all. On the first morning, the gas station on the corner where he had filled his tank for 8 years told him the pumps were broken. He drove to the second station, 2 miles away, and the pumps there were broken too. By the 4th station, the boy behind the counter didn't say anything. He only looked at him and shook his head. At noon that day, an ATM swallowed his card, and when he called the bank, they told him his account had been closed for an internal review, that they couldn't provide any further information, and that they were sorry for the inconvenience. That afternoon, the landlord of the room he rented was waiting outside the door with all his belongings packed into 2 black garbage bags. No one cursed at him. No one threatened him. People simply stopped seeing him. By the second day, 3 of his men had stopped answering their phones. By the third day, none of them answered anymore. The warehouse where he stored his merchandise had a new lock on the door, and the lock wasn't his, and no one knew who had installed it. The entire city of Chicago turned its back on Callahan Driscoll at the same moment, precisely and silently, as though someone somewhere had lowered a switch. On the third night, he came looking for August himself. He stood inside the harbor warehouse beneath the hanging ceiling light, and his leather jacket was gone, and his hands were trembling, and he said please. He said please 3 times. August Halloran stood 4 steps away and looked him over from head to toe. Her name was Ruth Kessler, he said. Cal looked up. She worked as a nurse for 25 years. Then she opened a laundromat and washed clothes for that entire neighborhood for another 20 years. She washed clothes for the mothers of half the men who work for you. He paused. You knew her. Cal Driscoll opened his mouth. and the truth fell out before he had time to consider it. And it was the worst thing he could have said. "I don't know who she was." August nodded slowly. "That's right," he said. "That's exactly the problem." Then he took out his phone, dialed 3 numbers, and gave the address in the voice of a man calling for a taxi. Cal didn't run. There was nowhere left to run in a city that had switched him off. The police arrived 11 minutes later, and August stood there watching as they placed him in handcuffs, and he signed the informant's statement with his real name. Delaney stood across the yard with her hands in the pockets of her coat, and she had seen everything. When the police lights disappeared beyond the yard gate, she walked toward him. "I thought you would do something else," she said. August looked down at his hands. The knuckles of his right hand were still purple from that morning outside the diner. "I was going to do the thing I wanted most," he said. "I stood there, and I wanted it so badly that my hands shook. Then, I didn't do it. Why? Because the old man taught me something on the day he picked me up from a bench at the bus station." He slipped his hands into his pockets. "He told me, you can do anything you want, except the thing you want most." He could have left it alone. That was what anyone else would have done. Cal Driscoll was already sitting in a cell. The court had enough witnesses. And there wasn't a single thread in this world connecting the name August Halloran to that wooden staircase. All he had to do was remain silent. He drove her home, pulled up in front of the laundromat, and she had already placed her hand on the door handle when he spoke. "Stay for 1 minute." She stayed. He looked straight through the windshield without turning toward her. "There was a night at the South Container Yard," he said. "Cal opened one of our shipments. I went there, stood in front of him, and said something. I told him that if he touched the old man, I would care." He paused. "He asked me, 'What old man?'" Delaney didn't move. "The entire city believed he had been lying beneath the snow for 2 weeks," August said. "That was the only thing keeping him alive. No one hunts a man who is already dead." Cal knew nothing. "He had no reason to look for your home. He didn't even know your home existed." His hands tightened around the steering wheel, and he spoke the final sentence in the flat voice of a man reading his own sentence aloud. "I showed him the way," he said. "Ruth died because I opened my mouth." The car remained silent for a long time. Outside, the peeling sign with half the name Kessler still visible hung above them. Delaney Woods didn't scream. She didn't strike him. She didn't say a single word. She opened the car door, stepped into the snow, climbed the stairs, and never looked back. For 3 days, she didn't leave the apartment. She didn't go to work. She sat at the kitchen table where Ruth had sat every morning with her cold cup of tea, and she stared at the empty chair across from her, and she let the anger run through every part of her until there was nowhere left for it to go. On the 3rd night, she took out the leather-bound notebook. The old man was asleep in the next room, and she sat beneath the desk lamp and began again from the first page, more slowly than before, reading more carefully than before, because now she knew who had written it. And near the middle of the notebook, between the reminders about how to tie his shoes and the warnings not to sleep outside the train station, there was a page where the ink had faded more than the rest, written years earlier, when his hand was still steady. "August isn't sleeping again. The boy thinks he is the worst thing in the room. He doesn't know he is the only thing keeping me sane." Delaney read those 4 lines 3 times, exactly as she had read the first 4 lines in the laundromat weeks earlier. Then she closed the notebook. On the morning of the court hearing, August was standing beside the car, expecting nothing, when he saw her walking toward him from the end of the street. She wore the blue sweater and black pants, the finest clothes she owned, the same clothes she had worn when she went to return a key. She handed him the notebook, already open to that page. He read it. He spent a very long time reading those 4 lines. "I haven't forgiven you," she said. "I don't know when I will. Maybe I never will." He nodded, his eyes still fixed on the page. "But he already has," she said. "He forgave you before you even had the chance to make the mistake. It is right there, written in his own hand, from before you and I had ever seen each other's faces." She opened the car door. "Are you going to argue with him?" And that was the day they went to the Cook County Courthouse. They never reached the courthouse that morning. They arrived at the apartment above the laundromat and found the couch in the living room empty, the blanket folded into a neat square, and on the kitchen table, placed carefully beneath a teacup, was a sheet of A4 paper, a copy of an admission order for a facility called Fairhaven, signed by Spencer Halloran as temporary guardian, stamped and dated 3 days earlier. 3 days earlier had been the day Delaney sat in the kitchen staring at the empty chair and never left the apartment. August's 2 men watching the entrance from the street hadn't stopped anyone, because what came to collect the old man wasn't a black car. It was an ambulance carrying 2 attendants in white uniforms and a file of valid documents. No one stops an ambulance. Fairhaven stood to the northwest, a 2-story red brick building with a lawn, cut perfectly flat, and a beautiful sign written in elegant script. Inside, it was clean, warm, and scented with lemon. It was the worst place August Halloran had ever entered in his life, because at the harbor, he knew what to do with a door. But here, the door was locked by the signature of someone with legal authority, and there wasn't a hammer in the world that could break through that. They weren't allowed inside. Everyone was very polite. They said the patient was undergoing medication stabilization. They said only the legal guardian had the authority to approve visitors. They invited them to sit in the waiting area. Delaney walked along the hallway until she found the glass window of room 12. He sat in a wheelchair facing the window. She knocked. She called his name through the glass. She knocked harder. She called louder, and he turned his head. He looked directly into her face, and there was nothing there. It wasn't the look of a man trying to remember, the look she had seen in the diner kitchen and had learned how to endure. This was different. His eyes passed over her face as though passing over a wall, and then he turned back toward the window. Someone had given him something, and whatever it was had extinguished the final flame still burning inside him. Delaney stood there with her palm pressed against the glass, in exactly the same position she had stood outside the neonatal ward at Mercy. And this time, she said nothing either. August went outside and made 3 telephone calls. The first was to Hollis Price. The second was to someone at a bank whom he hadn't called in 4 years. The third lasted 8 minutes. Fairhaven was a private facility, and a private facility had a balance sheet, and Fairhaven's balance sheet had a hole of $2,800,000 that it was repaying in installments to a bank in Rosemont. He didn't buy Fairhaven. Buying a medical facility required due diligence, transfer licenses, a board, and 6 months. He bought the debt. Buying debt required only cash and a signature, and he completed it in a single afternoon. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, he entered the director's office without knocking, placed a file on the desk, and sat in the chair opposite him. The director read the first page. Then he looked up with the face of a man who had glanced downward and discovered that the floor was no longer there. "I've held your debt since 2 o'clock this afternoon," August said. "I can foreclose on this place Monday. 41 patients will have to be transferred, 80 employees will lose their jobs, and your name will appear in every newspaper in this city." He didn't change his tone or lean forward. "Or you open room 12 right now, and I forget that I have these papers." The door to room 12 opened at 10 minutes past 4. They wheeled him into the hallway, and he sat there with his calloused hands resting on his thighs, wearing a pale blue hospital gown, and he didn't recognize anyone. He looked at August. Nothing. He looked at the girl. Nothing. Delaney knelt in front of the wheelchair. She placed both hands on the armrests, opened the leather-bound notebook across his lap, and began reading aloud. "You don't remember your name," she read. "That's all right. You remember why you left. Don't trust anyone wearing a suit." She turned the page. "Today is cold. Don't sleep outside the train station." She turned another page. "Tie your shoes before you walk out the door." She read every page, one day at a time. An entire winter written by a man sending letters to himself so he wouldn't disappear, and her voice broke near the middle of the notebook. But she didn't stop. She kept reading, and the entire Fairhaven hallway fell silent as a waitress read an old man the words he had written in his own hand. She reached the final page. "You're looking for your daughter," she said. She stopped reading. She lifted her eyes to his face. "I'm here. I found you." And something happened behind those gray eyes. It was slow, and it was difficult, and it looked like someone dragging something unbearably heavy up from deep beneath the water. His hand lifted from his thigh. It searched for her hand on the armrest. It found it, and he remembered. For one moment, only one moment, he remembered. The courtroom at the Cook County Courthouse was smaller than people imagined, with a low ceiling, wooden benches, and the smell of old paper. Conrad Halloran sat in the front row wearing the gray suit Hollis Price had brought to Fairhaven that morning, clean-shaven, his hair combed, his back straight. 3 doctors took turns presenting their findings, and Spencer's attorney read aloud a very long list of the things a 68-year-old man could no longer do for himself. Then the judge asked whether Conrad wished to say anything. Conrad stood. "They are right, Your Honor," he said. The entire room went still. Even his own attorney looked up. "I forgot the name of the dog I raised for 10 years, Conrad said. I forgot what my wife looked like. This morning, I forgot how to button my shirt, and someone had to do it for me. I am not standing here to argue with the doctors. I have no intention of insulting them by claiming they are wrong." He sat down, and after that, everything ended quickly. The judge declared Conrad Halloran legally incapacitated and granted guardianship to the son who had filed the petition, Spencer Halloran. The gavel struck once with a dry sound. Spencer had won, but the hearing wasn't over, because there was still the matter of who would be permitted access to the patient. And that was when Marguerite Halloran rose with a file in her hand. "Your Honor," she said, her voice smooth as silk, "a young woman has been living under the same roof as my father for an entire month. I believe the court should know who she is." She read aloud from the Illinois state record, opened when Delaney was 15. Theft, running away, 7 foster homes throughout her childhood. "She has already taken once," Marguerite said, turning to look directly at Delaney. "Now she is taking an entire fortune." Delaney stood. She had no attorney. She wore the blue sweater. She stood straight with both hands resting at her sides and looked directly toward the judge. "Yes, Your Honor," she said. "I took $60. The room fell silent. That house received money from the state to care for me, yet they strictly locked away the food pantry and kept me on the verge of starvation. For 2 years, I was 15, and I took $60 from a drawer, and I ran away." Her voice wasn't loud. It was simply very steady. "Would Your Honor like to know what I bought with that money? A bus ticket and 3 loaves of bread. I ate all 3 at the bus station. It was the first time in 2 years that I had eaten until I was full." She sat down. No one spoke. The judge looked down at the file in Marguerite's hand far longer than necessary, then placed it aside, and the way he set it down said more than anything he could have declared aloud. Then Marguerite Halloran did the thing that destroyed her. During the 3 days before the hearing, she had asked the family attorney why her name wasn't on the guardianship petition, and 3 times the attorney had tried to explain that a person with a prior assault conviction couldn't legally serve as guardian, even if the case had been settled, even if it had happened 7 years earlier. She didn't believe him. She didn't believe him because she was Marguerite Halloran, and no law had ever applied to her in her entire life. She believed her younger brother had pushed her aside, so she stood a second time and requested permission to address the character of the newly appointed guardian, and her voice remained smooth as silk through the 3rd sentence. And then she testified. She testified because she wanted to drag Spencer down with her, and the entire courtroom heard what had been buried for 26 years. The brother and sister had lived for 26 years inside a lie. In the end, what destroyed them wasn't the truth. It was a lie they had told each other. When the noise in the courtroom finally subsided, Hollis Price stood. He was 71 years old, and he had spent 40 years standing inside rooms like this one, and he was in no hurry. "Your Honor, my client has a safe deposit box at the LaSalle Street branch. I respectfully request permission to open it here, before the court, in accordance with proper procedure." He turned toward the gallery. "Miss Woods, the key, please." Delaney sat frozen. Then she reached into the pocket of her sweater and took out the piece of metal she had held through 2 bus rides home from Ridgemont Hills, the thing she had been ordered to throw into the snow. She had no idea what she had been carrying. She never had. Hollis opened the box. Inside there was no money, no gold, and no will. There was only a packet of documents about 30 pages thick, notarized and signed nearly a year earlier, at a time when every doctor named in the record confirmed that Conrad Halloran had been fully competent. It was an irrevocable trust. 41% of Halloran Group had been transferred into that trust on that date, with Hollis Price named as trustee. It hadn't been transferred today. It hadn't been transferred the week before. It had been done nearly a year earlier, quietly, through a shell company, in cash, while the entire family was busy counting down the days until they could divide what they believed would be theirs. "Your Honor," Hollis said, "a man who has lost legal capacity cannot lose what he gave away while he was still of sound mind." Spencer Halloran sat at the table across the room and didn't move. He had won. He held the paper in his hand. He had the power to decide what the old man ate, where he slept, and which medications he was given. He had fought through an entire winter to claim an old man. He won. Then they handed him the bill. Hollis Price had 2 more things in his briefcase. The first was an envelope from a private laboratory in Evanston, delivered 3 weeks earlier and still unopened. Inside were the results of a comparison between a sample taken from Conrad Halloran and another collected from the rim of the water glass that Delaney had been drinking from. which the elderly attorney had quietly slipped into his leather briefcase. Hollis read the percentage aloud, and Delaney heard it, but she didn't understand what it meant until everyone in the courtroom turned to look at her at the same time. The second item was a USB drive. The recording lasted 3 minutes and 10 seconds, and had been filmed from inside a car parked across the street in Ridgemont Hills, with the date and time displayed in the lower corner. Spencer Halloran had made the recording. He had filmed it to prove before the court that his father was no longer truly a person. The entire courtroom watched the screen in silence. They watched an old man standing before an iron gate. They watched a woman in a fur coat step out of a car and tip the cup in her hand. They saw the dog. Then they saw a young woman in a waitress uniform run between them with nothing but an aluminum tray in her hands, and they watched her remain there until the animal backed away. No one in the room said a word. The judge watched all 3 minutes and 10 seconds. Then he looked toward Marguerite for a very long time. The two of them were allowed into a small room behind the courtroom, with one table, 2 chairs, and a window overlooking the parking lot. Delaney sat down. Conrad sat across from her. For a while, he said nothing. He only reached out slowly, took hold of her wrist, and turned it beneath the light. The silver bracelet slid downward. He turned its inner surface toward him. There, beneath 26 years of skin, soap, and water, were 2 initials worn almost completely away, D.H., 2 marks she herself had seen 1,000 times, and had always mistaken for scratches, wondering why her childhood bracelet didn't match her name, Delaney Woods. "I carved D.H. Delaney Halloran with a box cutter," he said, in the waiting room. "The night you were born." His calloused hand held her wrist very gently, as though he were afraid it might break. "I sat there all night. I didn't know what else to do. I was never good with small things. I only thought that if you ever became lost, the world could look here and know who you belonged to." Delaney looked down at her wrist. She had kept the adjustable bracelet since before she could speak. 7 families had sent her back, and not one of them had taken it from her because it was cheap silver and worth almost nothing. And now she sat in a room inside the Cook County Courthouse knowing that it was the only thing in the world that had ever tried to hold on to her. She didn't call him father. That wasn't the first word that left her mouth. "Why didn't you keep looking for me?" Her voice was very quiet. It wasn't angry. It was only asking, exactly as a child would ask, and it was the question she had carried inside herself for 26 years. "Why didn't you look for me longer?" Conrad Halloran remained silent for a very long time. "I did look," he said. "For 26 years, I never missed a single year." His eyes filled with tears, and he didn't wipe them away. "I only looked in the wrong place. My child, I looked in cemeteries." Beyond the window, snow fell over the parking lot, slowly and without wind. Delaney didn't cry. She left her hand resting quietly inside his, and looked at those 2 hands. One calloused from loading cargo 40 years earlier, the other scarred by grease and boiling water over the past 4 years. Then she spoke one sentence, very softly, without explaining anything. "I signed once before," she said. "They called it mercy." Conrad didn't ask what she meant. He only tightened his hold slightly, and the 2 of them sat there in the small room behind the courtroom without saying anything more, with a thin silver bracelet resting between their wrists. August waited in the hallway outside. He had been standing there for 40 minutes, and when the door opened and she stepped out, he didn't ask her anything. The 2 of them walked to the parking lot together, and a thin layer of snow had settled over the hood of the black car, and he stopped beside the door without opening it. "There's something," he said. Delaney waited. She had learned that when this man said there was something, it was best to stand still. 10 years ago," he said, "I had a very bad night." He looked toward the road. "I was 24. The old man had just handed the harbor over to me, and I thought I knew what I was doing, and that night I learned I didn't know anything at all. My coat was torn at one shoulder. I had wrapped my hand in a dish towel I grabbed from somewhere. I didn't have a single cent in my pocket. Do you understand? Not that I had very little. I had nothing. I couldn't even remember where I had left my wallet. I walked all night because I didn't dare go home with my face looking the way it did." He paused. "Then I saw a diner with its lights still on. The entire city had gone dark, but that place was still glowing." Delaney stood perfectly still. "I sat down at the far end of the counter. I sat there because it was warm inside. I wasn't planning to order anything. I didn't have the money to order. Then a young waitress came out. She couldn't have been 18 yet. She looked at me for exactly 2 seconds, then went into the kitchen, came back, and slid a bowl of soup across the counter toward me. His voice didn't change, but something inside it slipped half a beat out of place. I told her I couldn't pay for it. She said, "The diner is closed, but the soup hasn't figured that out yet." Delaney didn't breathe. She didn't ask my name. She didn't ask what had happened to my hand. She didn't ask where I had come from. She only stood there wiping glasses until I finished eating. Then she took the bowl away and told me to be careful, because the floor near the door was slippery. He turned and looked at her. "I searched for you for 10 years, he said. "I had money. I had people. I had everything. I went back to that diner 3 times during the first year, and no one knew who you were. You changed shifts. You changed diners. In the state records, after you ran away from foster care to return to Ruth, she hid you under 4 different surnames to keep the state from taking you away again. I lost your trail completely. 10 years. Delaney opened her mouth. Nothing came out. "You don't remember me," he said. "That's all right. I remember enough for both of us." She stood there in the parking lot of the Cook County Courthouse, wearing her blue sweater, and she tried to remember. She truly tried. But over those 4 years, she had pushed thousands of bowls of soup across that counter, toward thousands of men who couldn't pay, because that was what she did, because that was what she had always done, and not one of those bowls had ever seemed special to her. That was precisely what had saved him. 10 years earlier, a 17-year-old girl had pushed a bowl of soup toward the man who would become the most powerful figure at the Chicago harbor. 10 years later, that same girl, in that same diner, had run into the snow to save an old man whom others had abandoned outside a gate. The same pot of soup, the same pair of hands. And throughout those 10 years, none of the 3 of them had known. The last question she asked him wasn't in the courtroom. It came late one afternoon in the apartment above the laundromat, while he sat at the kitchen table where Ruth had always sat, and she placed the leather-bound notebook in front of him. "How did you know it was me?" she asked. "Was it only because of the bracelet?" Conrad shook his head. He turned the notebook back to the first page, the page she had read inside the darkened laundromat many weeks earlier, and pointed to the 4 lines at the bottom, written in the same ink on the same day, the day he had walked away from the Iron Gate and into the city. "Find the diner that still has its lights on after the entire city has gone dark. The girl will be there. She always feeds people." Delaney stared at those 4 lines for a long time. "You wrote this before you met me," she said. "You had never seen my face. How could you have written it?" Conrad looked down at his own handwriting, and he spoke the sentence he had said 100 times throughout that winter, and this time it felt colder than all the others. "I didn't write it," he said. "I don't remember writing that." Hollis Price was sitting in the 3rd chair, and he set down his cup of tea. "He didn't write it," he said. "Mrs. Kessler did." The entire kitchen went silent. 3 years ago, she sent me a letter," Hollis said. She knew she didn't have much time left. She was too afraid to meet anyone, and she was too afraid to sign her name. "She only wrote down where you worked, the hours you worked, and the kind of person you were. Then she told me that if the day ever came when he began to forget, I was to give it to him. I kept it for 3 years. Then that day came, and I didn't give him the letter, because he would have lost it within a week. I copied it into the notebook he kept in his coat pocket, so that one morning he would open it himself and find it." The woman who had remained silent for 26 years had finally found a way to speak. She didn't use her voice. She used a letter, an old lawyer, and a notebook resting inside the coat pocket of a man who was forgetting the entire world. That spring, the Ruth Kessler Dialysis Center opened on the south side, free to anyone who walked through its doors. The lobby was always loud with the children of the patients receiving treatment, running around the plastic chairs and filling the entire building with laughter. One little girl, perhaps 5 years old, walked over to where the old man sat in the corner and handed him a crayon drawing of a house, a sun, and 4 people standing in a row. He didn't remember her name. He thanked her, folded the picture with great care, and slipped it between the pages of the leather-bound notebook. On opening day, he stood to say a few words, and he managed exactly 4 sentences before his memory slipped away. "I have 4 children," he said. "I raised 3 of them. But the 4th, my only blood, was the one who chose me when I had nothing left. Someone once believed that blood decided who was allowed to remain in this family, and she was wrong, and that mistake destroyed an entire family for 26 years. He looked down at his calloused hands. Blood doesn't make children. Being there does. The trust was divided into 2 equal shares, one for August Halloran and one for Delaney Woods, and she refused hers for 3 weeks until Conrad told her he wasn't giving her money so she could become wealthy. He was giving it to her so that no child would ever again have to steal $60 simply to eat until they were full. The copper kettle still opened every morning. The old man sat at the table beside the window, and on some days he knew who she was, and on other days he didn't. On the days he didn't, she still pulled out the chair and sat beside him, still pushed a plate of bread across the table, and still said the same words. "Hello, sir. I'm Delaney. I'm your daughter." And every day, he cried, as though he were hearing it for the first time. In Ridgemont Hills, August removed the lock from the iron gate and threw it into the trash. The guard who had once ordered an old man to leave now stood there every morning, opening the gate for people who had nowhere else to go, and he knew every one of them by name. The wealthiest man in Chicago forgot almost everything. He forgot the names of the banks, he forgot the combinations to the safes. But every morning, when a waitress pushed a plate of bread across the table, he remembered the only thing worth remembering. And a gate is only iron until someone chooses to open it. This story leaves behind one very simple truth. We often believe that a person's worth can be found in the clothes they wear, the address where they live, or the name printed on their business card. But an old man who can no longer remember his own name is still a human being. And the way we treat him, when he has nothing left to offer us, is the truest answer to the question of who we are. Kindness requires no conditions. It doesn't need to know who the other person is in advance, and it never disappears. It only travels in a circle and returns to find us when we least expect it. Family is the same. It isn't written in blood. It is written in the mornings when we choose to sit beside one another, even when the other person has forgotten who we are. If this story touched something inside you, please leave a like, share it with someone you believe needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more new stories every day. How did this story make you feel? And which part made you pause the longest? Please leave a comment below. We truly want to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. May you and your family always be blessed with abundant health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.